Welcome back to CannaWeek, brought to you by New Frontier Data, where we deliver the week's top headlines in cannabis and hear experts weigh in on the impacts these are having on the industry. I'm your host, Heather Wickline. We have a great show for you today. It is the kickoff of the start of our 2020 election coverage, and what better place to start than talking about Arizona. Joining us today is the co-founder, board member, and CEO of Harvest Health and Recreation. He is also the president of the Arizona Dispensary Association, founding board member of the Policy Center for Public Health and Safety, and is the founder and currently serves on the board of directors for Harvesting Hope, a nonprofit organization that supports young children suffering from seizure disorders through the benefits of cannabis. Please welcome Steve White.
Thank you.
Well, you're a busy man, so we appreciate you making the time for us.
Of course.
And our next guest is a pioneering thought leader in the industry. If you have been around for a little bit, you have no doubt heard him speak. He is the leader of our amazing research team here at New Frontier Data and the Chief Knowledge Officer. Please welcome Mr. John Kagia. Welcome back.
Good to be back, Heather. Thank you.
Well, we have a lot to cover, so let's dive right in. Last week, Marijuana Moment reported slim majority of Arizona voters support marijuana legalization ballot measure, new poll finds. So as we know, Arizona is gearing up for a vote to legalize adult use cannabis this November. In early August, it was reported that 62% of voters supported adult use legalization. Now, a month later, that support has reportedly slipped to around 51%. And with high voter turnout scenarios projecting that support could fall as low as 49%. And this is all coming during a time where public perception of cannabis is at an all-time high, and while states are starved for any available source of tax revenue. So Steve, what is going on in Arizona? What do you attribute this slip in voter support in such a short period of time?
I think the first question is whether or not there's actually a slip in voter support. So you're talking about two different pollsters coming up with two different ideas. There have been some intermediate polls that were designed in order to raise money on the opposition side of things. And so as you're aware, in around election time, you can make polls say what you want them to say. So it's hard to tell without really diving into the crosstabs of some of these polls and understanding the demographics of who's being polled, whether or not there's, what the validity of that poll actually is. That being said, the most recent one that was reported on, it was done by a reputable pollster. And so what we've done is we've immediately mobilized and got into the field to figure out if there actually is an issue. Nationally, on cannabis, there isn't an issue, but we are seeing some trends nationally, some reactions to things like some of the, whether it's looting or violence against law enforcement. We are seeing some backlash from that emerging in some of the polling that we're seeing.
John, what are you seeing out there? Would you agree with that?
I would, and I think this is one of the great illustrations of how, despite the momentum behind cannabis legalization on a national basis, clearly the wind is behind the sails of a broad-based national shift in public opinions on this issue. Cannabis legalization is still a local issue. And in a state like Arizona, where it got really close last time in passing the legalization measure, but as we have approached this November's election, you've had a convergence of factors that I think began to have the potential to change the composition of the voter that we see actually show up either on election day or who end up sending their mail-in ballots. And so, at the risk of getting too far in the weeds, I think to Steve's point, one, kind of the impact of and backlash around the protests around policing, I think have been a catalyst to mobilize voters on both sides. Second, I think the debate around the kind of nomination of the next Supreme Court justice is going to be a really animating issue on both sides. And so, it is still a little unclear to say definitively which way the pendulum swings with these new factors being introduced 45 days before election day. But I think they compound what is already a kind of murky scene and trying to ascertain who is actually going to show up on election day and which side are they going to be leaning on this issue specifically.
Right. Well, when it comes to, I guess, the presidential nominee's stance on this cannabis reform, what impact, if any, do you think that has on the local level? Steve, I'll start with you.
Yeah, well, the fact that they're taking a stance has an impact on the local level. I mean, anytime you're starting a conversation, whether it's nationally or local, if it's nationally, it'll flow down to the local level. And the impact, there are certain policies that different administrations would push. I mean, we've seen the two candidates' platforms on cannabis, and they affect everything about our businesses. And so there is a big difference between the candidates on cannabis. But just the fact that we're talking about the issues and the way that we're talking about the issues is really positive for the industry at large.
John, what are your thoughts on that?
I think for those of us in the industry who've been following this issue for a while, who have had our sleeves rolled up for a while, we lose sight of the fact of how historic it is that representatives on both sides of the aisle are now mentioning cannabis as a substantive part of their party and the potential administration's policies. This is a sea change. We have come a really, really long way. And while, for example, on the left, if you look at the initial reaction by the industry when Biden cinched the nomination, that it would be status quo given his past positions on cannabis. I think it's been quite interesting to watch how proactively the Democratic ticket in particular has moved toward a more liberalized view of what cannabis might look like under a Biden administration. So certainly an energizing issue. I don't know how many single issue voters there are going to be in this election cycle, so people who are animated just by cannabis legalization. But I think particularly in a state like Arizona, where advocates came really, really close last time and felt like it was almost like a twist of fate that cost him getting adult use last time. I would anticipate that this cycle, there's going to be a lot of energy to try and ensure that it doesn't fail again.
Well, speaking of that, of the kind of the failed 2016 attempt, what do you think, Steve, are the main differences between what's on the ballot today and in 2016, and why that may have, I mean, just in terms of support, I guess?
Yeah, I think the biggest difference is not so much about the language, although we have addressed the issues that some of the opponents raised in 2016 in the current version. The bigger issue is the work that we've done with the opposition. And so we have people that we know who in 2016 wrote big checks to support the opposition campaign are actually supportive of the yes vote in 2020. And that process is a lengthy one, it's a time-consuming one, and it's sometimes a very painful one to have a lot of meetings with a lot of stakeholders to ensure, the election isn't always about, I mean, if you look at initiatives typically win, the ones who spend more money win. And so a big part of what we concentrated on this time around was making sure that there wasn't a big, well-funded, organized opposition. And I think we've succeeded there this time. And I think that is going to give us a very different result. Last time we saw, $8 million raised in opposition, which was larger than the next handful of campaigns combined. Because, there were some things that some people objected to. And with that money, they were able to control messaging better than we were. And that hurt us.
What do you think was the overall reason for people switching from the opposition to being pro cannabis now?
A couple things. First time, and as those of us who have been, as John referenced, those of us who've been doing this for a while see a real evolution that's occurring. And there's some people who, maybe their family member or something like that was affected by something, and then they used cannabis and it was helpful. That's one opportunity where you swing somebody. The other one is, last time there were a lot of people talking about what the initiative had in it, and they got the message out very effectively. The problem was they weren't telling the truth about what was in the initiative. This time around, we've gone to those people and told them, this is what's in it. What are your specific objections to these issues? How can we address them? So it's a lot harder then for the opposition movement to go back and make up stories about what's in your initiative when these people have already been, been contacted and had a chance to weigh in on things that concern them.
Yeah, John and I have talked about this quite a bit, about how it just seems like more and more people these days have had some kind of interaction with cannabis, whether or not they've used anything, but it's, their grandmother has used it for like glaucoma, or a friend of theirs or family friend used it for, treating cancer symptoms. I mean, I think that then they're not the typical cannabis user. So I think just that education has been really, really impactful for a lot of people. John, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree. I we're having a conversation this morning about this idea of cannabis as a social contagion, where once it becomes a kitchen table issue, once it becomes a 1 degree of separation issue as opposed to a 6 degree of separation issue. So a colleague, a coworker, a friend, a family member who has been impacted by it, whether it is impacted on the law enforcement side or impacted on the medical and therapeutic side, or impacted because they went into an adult use market and had their minds completely blown by what a legal, vibrant, regulated environment could look like. Once that kind of experience has happened in your own personal network, particularly on the medical side, it becomes a much more difficult issue to oppose. If grandmama has benefited because her arthritis is much improved, she's sleeping better, she's dying with dignity, you find that the allies you end up building a coalition of people whose motivations to reassess this issue may be varied, but the collective outcome ends up being the same, where you end up being able to build a much more diverse coalition of allies than you might have been able to do on some other issues. I suppose one of the questions I would have for Steve is, what role the kind of issue of the economic impact, specifically in Arizona, has had in shaping the campaign and the debate, particularly now that we're in peak COVID season and we've seen what that has done to state and local government budgets. Has the positioning of the potential economic impact shifted as we've kind of gone through this COVID experience and gotten closer to the election with no end in sight on this potential impact?
It's a great question. And the polls a while ago suggested that would have a big impact. The thing that wasn't anticipated was Arizona's budgetary shortfall is not as large as some of the other places. We're generally speaking a well-run state that runs a surplus on the budget. And that's really unique. But that being said, you see a lot of industry shutting down. You see tax revenues have fallen significantly. And it is still something that we often talk about because there is money that is specifically delegated to places that if we didn't have money specifically delegated to them, they wouldn't be funded. And so those kind of stories, the more as we get closer to election day, which election day now kind of spans over a multi-week period, more so than it ever has, you're going to hear more and more stories about the actual impact of those revenue dollars on things that affect Arizonans' lives. And we think that should cause voters to really think about whether or not those programs are worthy of a yes vote.
Now, I think that's an interesting and really important angle here to this conversation. And I think there's 2 tiers to it. So one is about funding programs, so getting money into state and local government coffers. And in the case of Arizona, our modeling is indicating that by year 4 post legalization, if this goes through, the state could be generating upwards of $1 billion each year from the sale of legal cannabis. And so there's within that, you have encapsulated jobs, you have tax revenues for state and local governments. And I think that's a resonant message. But I also think, particularly at a time when we continue to see some really acute unemployment numbers, people who were once benefiting from kind of the government stimulus checks who are no longer receiving them, personal finances, I think, are a much more prevalent kitchen table issue. And I think in that context, for voters who've been impacted by the broader economic situation, if you're talking about, hey, we could be jumpstarting $1 billion economy in our state, that I think also has a resonant appeal to folks who are feeling the acute financial strain of this moment.
Right. Well, I guess, Steve, not to start with the negative, but what do you think the implications are for the future of Arizona's market if this doesn't pass?
If it doesn't pass, it'll continue to grow at the rate that it's been growing, which is, for us, a long time ago, we used to think that maturation or full saturation in a medical market was about 2% of the population. And we've since had to adjust those numbers, and I'm sure John can attest to that. The Arizona is a great example of a market that whatever number we put out, it just keeps growing through whatever barrier we put in place. And the expectation would be that would continue as a medical market. That being said, the transition from a medical market to a rec market in Arizona is inevitable. The question isn't whether it happens; it's a question of when it happens and in what format it happens. And so, this will not be an issue that goes away. If there is an adverse decision by the voters in Arizona this election cycle, we're not going to go away as an industry. It's as an industry, and then there's so many other things in this legislation that are really important for Arizonans generally. That I think we'll be back at it before we know it. It feels like after having been defeated in 2016, it felt like we had just enough time to wring our hands and lick our wounds, and then we were back to the place where we were talking about writing checks again to get the thing rolling again. You'll see that in the future if we are voted down.
John, do you agree?
Yeah, I do. I think Arizona is a great case study in the impossibility of putting the genie back in the bottle. And if through no other lens, if you just think about this from a demographic standpoint and the fact that support for full legalization is almost 3 times as high amongst those under 35 than it is amongst those over 55. It's an inevitability that as you start seeing younger voters get more engaged in the political process and as elections and get more engaged in the election process, I think the momentum is naturally in favor of ultimately getting toward adult use legalization. And then second, the point I think Steve made is really important, which is to understand that because the medical market is already in place, it's vibrant, it's growing and growing aggressively. It means that as more time goes by, then medical cannabis and the exposure to cannabis writ large becomes more normalized in Arizona. And this is where you get back to this idea of this being a kitchen table issue. So as more people get exposed to medical cannabis, they start understanding who within their social circles or professional circles are using it and seeing benefit from it, then that kind of erodes these very stiff points of resistance that you've historically seen that are based on either misinformation or lack of information. And ultimately, I think that gets you to an environment where people who might have been once staunch opponents start saying, it's not that big a deal, the sky isn't falling. And within that context, if Arizona passes, you then have an unbroken line that gets you down across the Pacific states from Washington, Oregon, California, Nevada, Arizona, through to Colorado. So you've got this long corridor. And so Arizonans do have the benefit of being able to look around their neighbors and seeing other states that have legalized. Second, in terms of the upper bound of the medical market, using Oklahoma as an example, where the patient saturation is already at 8%. It's insane how quickly that market has grown. But I think a good illustration of what happens where absent an adult use market, there is still very robust opportunity to build very successful, very dynamic medical markets. And I think Arizona is going to continue to grow in that regard, regardless of what happens on the adult use side.
Awesome. Well, on a more positive note, Steve, if adult use does pass in Arizona, what's on the horizon for Harvest and near-term opportunities or challenges?
Yeah, there's in this industry, there's always a challenge every time you see a big transition or a change in the law. But at the same time, those present the opportunities in cannabis as well. So for us, I mean, operationally, we have to spend a lot of time thinking about what the new rules are going to look like and how we need to operate our business to best serve customers. We need to be thinking about the broader scope of people that we're serving. We're no longer serving just medical patients, but anyone who's 21 years and older who wants to walk into the store. And so those are the challenges. Most of the challenges would be operational. And most of those opportunity is the market itself, we expect will be much larger if we are able to sell to anybody who is 21 years older than it is today. And so we would hope to capture additional market share in the market, which would be kind of a double multiplier for us if we're capable of doing that, because the market grows and if we're able to capture higher market share because of the opportunity with the transition. Those are the things that we're talking about internally. Obviously, 1st November has to go the right way. We are hopeful that it will, and when it does, we'll be prepared to take advantage of all the changes.
Nice. Well, we'll all be hoping and watching to see what happens.
I have a question for you, Steve, on that. You know, as you look out to the possibility of adult use passing, what, as kind of the CEO of Harvest, are you most excited about, whether it's on the product side, the service delivery side? What have you not been able to do on the medical side, do you think is going to be a uniquely exciting opportunity for you as you look at the adult use market opportunity? Yeah,
the biggest thing is the expansion of the customer base. And so the way that we think about marketing, for example, is so specific to a very defined subset of people that you have certain things that you just can't do. And then there's a certain, you know, they're unified by the fact that they have a qualifying condition and they've been to a doctor. Now, all of a sudden, we're just like any other business where we get to reach people in ways that are more fun than through a qualifying condition. And so it allows for us and for our team to be more creative about how we reach people, how we talk to them, and how we provide them with different products. But it really is for us an opening of the universe a bit. And that applies across all a number of different departments at Harvest for sure.
That's awesome. All right. Well, any final thoughts for our audience before we say goodbye? John, Steve, either one.
Yeah, I could always make the pitch for people that donate to Smart and Safe Arizona. I mean, it is a program. One of the things to keep in mind, even if you don't live in Arizona, is that every time a state does flip, it makes it more likely that your state will as well. And so if you go online to Smart Safe Arizona, you can make small donations to the campaign. Those are always appreciated. And keep an eye on how we do in November. We're very excited about it. And we look forward to talking afterwards about some of the changes and answering really specifically John's question about how our life will change in Arizona for sure.
Awesome.
Well,
John.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to that is, you know, for those who are in states that have faced setbacks, and I think we've got two great examples of states that have not moved as progressively or aggressively as had been hoped in New York and Florida. I think Arizona is a really good case study, really good model to study, to understand what it means to kind of develop that level of stakeholder engagement that both gets you very quickly back on the ballot and does so with a strategy that's ensured or that's directed toward bringing in a coalition of folks who might have been initially opposed, but you have now the time to address their concerns and weave that into your second effort. This is a genie that is not going to be put back in the bottle. It is, in most markets, going to be an issue of when, not if. And there's a lot of utility in learning from those who've trodden the path rather than trying to reinvent the wheel in each instance.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys both for your time, for being here. And thank you to our listeners for joining us at CannaWeek. Please be sure to like and subscribe to the podcast. You can find these news stories and more at New Frontier Data's Cannabis Insights Daily. And be sure to check out our election coverage for updates on everything happening with the election in the cannabis industry. Go to newfrontierdata.com/2020. I'm your host, Heather Wickline, and I will see you next time.